Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here. U.S.-China making headlines again, off again, now on again. President Trump and President Xi going to meet in South Korea for several hours. This is a much anticipated meeting. It comes on the back of some escalation in the trade fight between the world's two largest economies, but it was always set up to get to compromise. So first, why the fight? In this case, the fight came because of a bit of miscommunication. You don't have trusted, regular, high-line engagement like you did at the end of the Biden administration between Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and Jake Sullivan, the then U.S. National Security Advisor. So it's easier for misinterpretation of moves, of tweets, and the rest. In this case, the United States was putting a new 50% rule, basically saying any Chinese companies that are 50% or more owned by a company on a sanctioned list are sanctioned themselves. That was hurried through to become a new rule for the United States right before the government shutdown. And therefore, it wasn't getting a lot of attention from the White House, and it wasn't seen by the United States as being a particularly big deal. The Chinese took it as such and didn't have a lot of context for it. They, in return, put these big new regulations for licensing agreements on critical minerals and rare earths that, if they were applied, would be massive and lead to shutdowns in the U.S. economy and for Europeans and others, but weren't applied. So it's basically putting a loaded gun on the table, but not pointing at anyone. That was in turn misinterpreted by the Trump administration. And that's when Trump came out and said 100% tariffs against China. But anyone talking to the governments in a private way understood that both wanted to get to yes, both wanted to retreat to a position of greater stability because both countries can do significant damage to the other economy, and they don't want to be in a worse position, a worse material position. They're not ready for the fight, particularly for the Trump administration, because they don't have coordination yet with allies on China policy, though they're starting to get there. And you see that with this week's meeting between Takaichi Sanai, the new Japanese prime minister, and Trump. And you've seen it with some of the recent European engagement with the U.S. on China as well. You also have only the beginnings of investment by the United States into rare earth exploitation and processing, and that's going to take years. So this is not the time for a fight for the United States. The Chinese economy is not doing particularly well. They don't want additional downward pressure. That's why we had good meeting over the weekend with the U.S. Secretary of Treasury and the Chinese premier, and that is set up to get to yes on Thursday between Trump and Xi. Markets like that certainly expect to see at least headline deal that would forestall further tariffs, U.S. export controls, Chinese licensing agreements for a period of time, 6 months, a year, maybe more, that they can continue going forward. Also expect to see reasonably positive noises on things like export controls and know your customer rules for precursor chemicals for fentanyl from the Chinese. Also on TikTok, getting to the Americans for the Chinese as well. And expect the United States to have something useful to say for the Chinese on Taiwan, though not fundamentally changing U.S. policy in providing support for them in defense if they were attacked. All of this is to say, set up to be a good meeting, but doesn't change Trump's baseline view that the most important adversary of the U.S. globally, as opposed to the most important adversary, period, which Trump sees to be domestic political opponents, but globally is China. And that is in the context of relatively stable U.S. military deployments across Asia, continued commitment of the United States to provide collective security for its core allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the like, and the fact that long term, the U.S. still sees a policy of containment and decoupling towards the Chinese as where the Americans are going. So consider this a period of stability against an environment of greater conflict and decoupling between the world's two largest economies, a really big deal as we think about moving away from further and faster globalization. Those are the big takeaways as I see them. We'll be following this over the course of the week, and I'll talk to y'all real soon.